Somewhere right now, someone brilliant is hitting every deadline, answering every message, showing up exactly as reliably as she always has. And she is completely empty on the inside in a way nobody around her can see because the performance never dropped. That's the part that makes burnout in high-functioning people so dangerous. It doesn't look like collapse. It doesn't look like someone falling apart in a way that triggers concern and support. It looks like someone still doing everything right, right up until the moment they can't anymore, and by then, it's not a warning sign. It's already happened. By the end of this video, you'll understand why capable people are often the last to notice their own burnout, not the first, and why the usual advice, rest more, set boundaries, fails to reach the actual mechanism keeping them stuck in it. You'll also have a specific test that reveals how close you actually are, even if everything still looks fine from the outside. Stay for that part. Most people who need it most are the ones most convinced they don't. The trap nobody sees coming. Here's the pattern before the psychology of why. Burnout is usually described as running out of energy, a battery draining to empty. That model works reasonably well for people whose performance visibly declines as they get more exhausted. It doesn't describe what happens in high-functioning people, because their performance is often the very last thing to go. Competence, especially competence built over years, runs partly on habit and identity, not just on available energy. A capable person can keep executing at a high level for a long time after the internal reserves are gone, because the execution has become close to automatic, which means the exhaustion accumulates invisibly, with no external signal telling anyone, including the person themselves, that something needs to change. This is why burnout in this population tends to arrive as a cliff rather than a slope. Not a gradual decline anyone could see coming and intervene on. A wall hit at full speed, after months or years of a system that looked, from every visible angle, like it was working fine. There's a specific reason this catches the most capable people hardest, and it's almost the inverse of how burnout gets talked about culturally. The common assumption is that burnout happens to people who can't manage their workload, that better time management or firmer boundaries would have prevented it. But the people most at risk of the cliff-shaped version of burnout are often the ones who are best at managing workload, precisely because their skill at managing it lets them absorb more for longer without any external signal that a limit is being approached. A less capable person hits friction earlier, and the friction itself becomes a natural break. A highly capable person removes the friction, again and again, which feels like success right up until there's no friction left to remove and no capacity left underneath it either. Point 1. When performance is the last thing to go. Call her Amara, a clinical psychologist we've spoken to before on this channel. In a different context, she has an unusual vantage point on this exact mechanism, because she watched it happen to herself while professionally trained to recognize it in others. For 8 months leading up to what she now calls her collapse, her clinical notes were thorough, her sessions were on time, her supervision feedback was excellent. Nothing in her performance showed a single crack. If this pattern is already sounding familiar, subscribe now. This is the third video in a series that builds on the last two, and this one ties several earlier threads together. I kept waiting to feel like I was struggling before I let myself believe I was struggling, she told us. But I never got the feeling. I just got the collapse. What Amara is describing is the specific danger of being someone whose competence is deeply overlearned, so practiced, so automatic, that it keeps running on structural habit long after the internal fuel that should be powering it has run out. There was no dip in quality to notice, no slow decline to catch early, because the skill itself doesn't require real-time energy the way it once did when she was newer at it. The cost of that automaticity showed up somewhere else entirely, not in her work, but in a body that eventually stopped negotiating and simply stopped. The collapse itself, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic in the way she'd have expected if you'd asked her beforehand to imagine it. No single terrible day, no visible breakdown at the office. She described waking up one ordinary morning and being unable to get out of bed, not from sadness she could name, just a total absence of the internal signal that had, every day for years, generated enough forward motion to start the day. The system that had been quietly running on override for the better part of a year didn't announce its exhaustion in advance. It simply stopped answering, all at once, the way a machine that's been run past its rated capacity doesn't slow down gradually, it fails. Point 2. When rest feels like disappearing. Call him Marcus, an operations lead whose team consistently describes him as unshakable, the person who stays calm during a crisis, picks up whatever slips, and never seems to need anything from anyone. When a mandatory week of leave was forced on him after a health scare, he described the experience not as relief, but as something close to panic. 4 days in, I didn't know who I was without something to solve. It wasn't restful. It was the loneliest week I've had in years, and nothing bad was even happening. Like this one, if any part of that lands for you, it helps this reach the next person running on empty without knowing it yet. This is the second mechanism, and it explains why telling someone like Marcus to simply rest more doesn't work, and sometimes makes things worse. For people whose identity has become fused with their output, rest isn't neutral. It's a small, temporary loss of self. If being valuable and being productive have become the same sentence, the exact trap this channel has covered before, in a different context, then stopping doesn't just remove a task from the schedule. It removes the mechanism by which Marcus knows he still matters, for however long the rest lasts. No wonder the body resists the very thing it most needs. Rest, to a system like this, doesn't read as recovery. It reads as a threat to the only identity that's ever felt secure. Marcus's team, when asked directly, described him as someone who never seems to need anything. A description meant as a compliment, and one Marcus has spent years quietly cultivating, because needing something has always felt to him dangerously close to being a liability rather than an asset. That belief didn't originate at this job. It's the same belief this channel has already traced in an entirely different fixer, in an entirely different episode, the equation between being needed and being safe, running here in a slightly different costume. Marcus isn't just tired. He's someone who built an entire professional identity around never appearing to require rest, and the forced week off didn't just interrupt his schedule. It interrupted the only proof he had that he was still valuable, and nothing replaced that proof for 7 straight days. Point 3. The identity crisis hiding inside every burnout. Call her Adiz, a novelist whose capacity to write, the thing she'd built her entire sense of self around since childhood, began, slowly, to disappear during her second year of sustained overwork. Not dramatically, just a quiet erosion. The words came slower, then less often than, for a stretch of several months, barely at all. The scariest part wasn't that I couldn't write, she said. It was that I didn't know who I was if I couldn't. Every other part of my identity had gotten smaller over the years to make room for this one thing. And now the one thing wasn't there, and neither was anything else. This is the deepest layer of the mechanism, the one that makes burnout in high achievers so much more than simple exhaustion. When your capability becomes your entire identity, burning out doesn't just cost you your output. It costs you the only stable sense of self you've maintained, because everything else that could have anchored an identity, hobbies, looser friendships, unstructured time, anything not in service of the main pursuit, got quietly deprioritized over years in favor of the thing that was working. Burnout, for someone like Adiz, isn't just running out of energy. It's a forced confrontation with the fact that there was never a backup identity built, because building one never seemed necessary while the primary one kept succeeding. The reveal, the warning system didn't fail, it got overridden. If you're recognizing yourself in any of this, hit like and stay for the next part, because this is where it turns into something you can actually use. Here's what Amara, Marcus, and Adiz all have in common once the specifics are stripped away. None of them were missing warning signs. Their bodies were almost certainly sending signals: fatigue, irritability, physical symptoms, a flattening of feeling, for months before anything visibly broke. What was missing wasn't the signal. It was the willingness, or in some cases the ability, to let a warning sign outrank an ongoing commitment to keep performing. Each time a signal arrived, competence and habit answered it by pushing through, successfully, which reinforced the exact behavior that was going to eventually cost them the most. Every successful override taught the system that overriding worked. Until it didn't, all at once, with no further warnings issued, because the warning system had effectively been trained into silence. The experiment. You cannot think your way out of a burnout you can't yet feel, because the entire mechanism depends on the feeling being suppressed successfully enough that performance never drops. You have to test for it deliberately, from the outside, because your own internal alarm has been overridden too many times to be trusted right now. Comment rest right now if you're actually going to try this, not just relate to it and keep scrolling. Here's the version that works. Schedule one full day, not a weekend trip, not a productive break, an entire day with a single rule: nothing that produces an output. No errands, no self-improvement, no catching up on anything, no reading something useful, no exercise framed as optimization. Genuinely unstructured time, alone with yourself, with nothing to show for it afterward. Then track one thing honestly throughout the day: how much resistance shows up and where. Not whether you enjoyed the day, whether you could tolerate it. Notice if guilt arrives. Notice if you find yourself inventing small tasks to feel less aimless. Notice if being unproductive for 8 hours feels like rest or feels like a threat. That resistance, if it's there, is the actual diagnostic. People who aren't running on fumes can usually tolerate a day like this without much internal protest. People who are close to the edge often can't make it past the first few hours without manufacturing something to do. And that inability is more informative than any exhaustion scale, because it shows you directly how fused your sense of safety has become with staying in motion. The reframe. Amara's collapse wasn't a failure to notice the signs. Marcus's panic during forced rest wasn't weakness. Adiz's identity crisis wasn't an overreaction to writer's block. In every case, a warning system that was working exactly as designed got overridden, successfully, over and over, until it stopped bothering to send the signal at all, not because nothing was wrong, but because nothing had ever been allowed to matter more than the performance staying intact. That's the pattern under why smart people burn out. Not laziness catching up to them, not a lack of resilience. A body that kept sending accurate information to a system that had learned, through years of reinforcement, not to listen until listening was no longer optional. If you're not sure whether you're closer to this edge than you think, the unstructured day is where to find out, not another round of pushing through and hopping the tiredness passes on its own. It's been passing on its own for a while now. That's part of how you got here. That question, what happens when the thing holding you together turns out to be the same thing wearing you down, is going to come up again on this channel, in more forms than one. If this video described you, the first two in this arc probably will too, and it's worth watching them in order. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next, and check the pinned comment for 2 short clips going deeper on pieces of this pattern this video didn't have room for.